In the year 1997, a team of marine geologists aboard a research vessel cut through the waters of the Persian Gulf, their instruments scanning the seafloor beneath. They were searching for oil deposits, charting the geological formations that had shaped this ancient basin over millions of years. But what they discovered would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the cradle of civilization. Beneath the waves, their sonar revealed something unexpected. The remnants of a vast river system, valleys carved deep into the bedrock, and what appeared to be a landscape that had once thrived above water. This was not the natural topography of an eternal sea. This was a drowned world. The Persian Gulf, that body of water stretching between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran, had not always been a gulf at all. It had been land, fertile land. A river valley as lush and life-giving as the Nile, the Indus, or the Tigris-Euphrates system that gave birth to Mesopotamia. And then, in a relatively short span of geological time, it had vanished beneath the rising waters of the Indian Ocean, swallowing everything that might have existed there: settlements, cultures, perhaps even the origins of civilization itself. If you're captivated by the hidden chapters of human history, by the civilizations that time forgot and the waters claimed, then stay with us on this journey. Subscribe now, because the stories we uncover here are the ones that rewrite what we thought we knew about our past. The story begins not in recorded history, but in the depths of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago. The world then was a vastly different place. Ice sheets kilometers thick covered much of the northern hemisphere, locking away so much of Earth's water that global sea levels stood more than 120 meters lower than they do today. Coastlines extended far beyond their present boundaries, land bridges connected continents, and the Persian Gulf did not exist. Where today we see water, there was instead a continuation of the Mesopotamian plain, a broad river valley through which flowed what geologists now call the Kuwait River. This was no minor waterway. Fed by the confluence of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and several other rivers flowing down from the Zagros Mountains and the highlands of Anatolia, the Kuwait River was a massive arterial channel, comparable in size and importance to any of the great rivers that nurtured the earliest human civilizations. Its valley stretched for nearly 900 kilometers from what is now the northern Persian Gulf all the way to the Strait of Hormuz, where it finally emptied into the Indian Ocean. The landscape surrounding this river would have been dramatically different from the arid deserts that characterize much of the region today. During glacial periods, global weather patterns shifted. The monsoon systems that now bring rain to South Asia extended further west. The Arabian Peninsula received significantly more rainfall. What we think of as desert was then savanna, grassland, even woodland in places. Springs bubbled up from underground aquifers, lakes dotted the interior, and along the Kuwait River Valley, the conditions for human settlement were ideal. Archaeological evidence from the surrounding regions confirms that humans were indeed present in the area during this period. Sites in the Levant, in the Zagros foothills, in Anatolia, all show continuous human occupation through the late Pleistocene. These were not yet the farming communities that would later build cities and empires. These were the last generations of hunter-gatherers, groups who followed animal migrations, harvested wild grains, fished in rivers and lakes, and lived in seasonal camps that left only the faintest traces in the archaeological record. But the Kuwait River Valley would have been prime territory. River valleys always are. They provide water, abundant plant and animal resources, natural routes for travel and trade, and fertile soil for the earliest experiments in cultivation. If humans were in the surrounding highlands and coasts, they were certainly in the valley. The question is not whether they were there, but what they built, what they achieved, and what stories they told around fires that burned where now only fish swim in the darkness. Then, around 15,000 years ago, the world began to warm. The Pleistocene gave way to the Holocene. The great ice sheets started their long, irregular retreat. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels began to rise. Slowly at first, mere millimeters per year, the change would have been imperceptible to any single generation. The river remained. The valley endured. Life continued as it had for thousands of years. But the pace of change accelerated. Between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, during periods climatologists call meltwater pulses, the rate of sea level rise increased dramatically. These were not gentle, gradual processes. There were relatively rapid floods of glacial meltwater entering the ocean system, raising global sea levels by meters within a few centuries. For people living in coastal areas and river valleys near sea level, the effects would have been catastrophic. The Persian Gulf basin, being relatively shallow and gently sloped, was particularly vulnerable. As sea levels rose, the Indian Ocean began to push inland through the Strait of Hormuz. The lower reaches of the Kuwait River Valley flooded first. Villages near the ancient coastline would have found the sea advancing year by year, generation by generation. Wells became brackish. Fishing grounds shifted. The river mouth retreated inland. For centuries, the people of the valley might have adapted, moving their settlements progressively northward, following the retreating margin between fresh water and salt. But the flood was inexorable. By approximately 8,000 years ago, the sea had penetrated far into the heart of the basin. The Kuwait River, once a mighty independent waterway, was being drowned from its mouth upward. Its valley became an estuary, then a bay, then a shallow sea. By 6,000 years ago, the transformation was complete. The Persian Gulf had reached approximately its modern configuration. Where once there had been a river valley potentially home to tens of thousands of people over millennia, there was now only water. The entire landscape, with whatever settlements, innovations, and cultural achievements it might have hosted, lay submerged beneath meters of silt and saltwater. This was not a flood in the sense of a single dramatic deluge, the kind of event preserved in myth and legend. It was a slow catastrophe, unfolding over thousands of years, during which entire populations would have been displaced, forced to migrate inland to the emerging landscapes of Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Arabian interior. These were not primitive refugees. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers on the cusp of the Neolithic Revolution, people who understood seasonal cycles, who had begun to experiment with plant cultivation, who built boats and knew the arts of fishing and navigation. The question that haunts researchers is what knowledge might have been lost in that slow drowning. When we trace the origins of agriculture, we find its earliest evidence in the hills of the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. But what if the Kuwait River Valley had already seen earlier experiments, initial attempts at cultivation that left no trace because they now lie beneath the waters? What if the true birthplace of settled civilization was not in the hills, but in the lowland river valley that no longer exists? Consider the timeline. The period of the Great Flooding, from 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, coincides exactly with humanity's most profound transformation, the shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, from temporary camps to permanent villages, from tribal societies to the first complex hierarchies that would eventually become cities and states. This transformation happened in multiple regions around the world, but nowhere more dramatically than in the Middle East, in the very regions that surround the drowned valley of the Persian Gulf. The traditional narrative tells us that agriculture began in the upland areas of the Fertile Crescent, in places like Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, in the Jordan Valley, in the Zagros foothills of Iran. From these highland origins, the story goes, farming cultures gradually spread into the lowland river valleys of Mesopotamia, where the great civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon would eventually arise. But this narrative has always had puzzles embedded within it. Why, for instance, does the Sumerian language, the oldest written language we have deciphered, appear to have no relatives? It is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to the Semitic languages spoken by Sumerians' neighbors, unrelated to any other known language family. The Sumerians themselves, in their own myths and legends, claim to have come from the sea, from a distant homeland they called Dilmun, a paradise lost, a place of fresh water and abundance that existed before the gods created the world as the Sumerians knew it. Dilmun features prominently in Sumerian mythology. It is described as a place where the water was fresh and pure, where sickness and death did not exist, where lions did not kill and wolves did not devour lambs. It was, in essence, a memory of Eden. Later, Mesopotamian cultures would continue to revere Dilmun, sometimes identifying it with the island of Bahrain in the western Persian Gulf, but the descriptions never quite fit. The mythical Dilmun was larger, more significant, more central to the origin story of Mesopotamian civilization. Could the drowned valley of the Kuwait River be the historical basis for these myths? Could Dilmun be the cultural memory of a lost homeland, submerged beneath the rising waters of the Persian Gulf? If so, then the people who brought agriculture, settled village life, and eventually urban civilization to Mesopotamia might not have been highlanders descending into the river valleys, but valley dwellers displaced by the flood, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge of generations. This hypothesis is not merely speculative. It is supported by a growing body of evidence from multiple disciplines. Marine archaeology in the Persian Gulf has been limited by political instability and restricted access, but the surveys that have been conducted have revealed tantalizing clues. Side-scan sonar has mapped ancient river channels beneath the sediment, confirming the existence of the Kuwait River system. Core samples from the seafloor show layers of terrestrial soil, indicating periods when the land was above water and potentially inhabited. In the year 2012, a team led by archaeologist Jeffrey Rose analyzed the distribution of Neolithic sites around the Persian Gulf basin and noted a striking pattern. Sites dating to the period immediately after the final flooding, around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, appear suddenly in a ring around what is now the coastline of the Gulf. These sites show evidence of sophisticated maritime cultures, people who fished, traded by boat, and built permanent settlements, but they appear without clear precursors in the immediate area. Where did these people come from? Rose's hypothesis. They came from the flooded valley itself, displaced by the rising waters, settling on the new coastlines that emerged as the Gulf reached its modern extent. Moreover, genetic studies of modern populations in the region show patterns consistent with a major population expansion and migration during this same period. DNA analysis reveals that many Middle Eastern populations share common ancestry dating back 7,000 to 8,000 years, suggesting a population bottleneck followed by rapid expansion and dispersal. This matches exactly what we would expect from a climate-driven displacement. Populations forced to abandon their homeland, fragmenting and spreading into new territories, mixing with existing highland populations, and eventually coalescing into the cultures we recognize in the historical record. The linguistic evidence, too, points toward hidden chapters in the region's prehistory. Beyond Sumerian, there are other linguistic isolates and strange anomalies in the region. The Elamite language of ancient Iran, which also has no clear relatives, might be another remnant of the drowned valley cultures. Certain substrate words in Semitic languages, terms related to agriculture, water management, and boat building, appear to have been borrowed from an unknown earlier language, possibly spoken by the populations who first brought these technologies to Mesopotamia. Then there are the flood myths themselves, which appear in virtually every culture of the ancient Middle East. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, tells the story of Utnapishtim, who survived a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The biblical story of Noah is almost certainly derived from this earlier Mesopotamian tradition. Similar flood narratives appear in Persian, Armenian, and Arabian sources. While floods are common natural disasters, and many cultures have flood myths, the specific details of the Middle Eastern versions, a catastrophic inundation that destroyed the world as it had been, forcing survivors to start anew, bear a striking resemblance to what would have been the lived experience of populations displaced by the flooding of the Persian Gulf basin. What would that experience have been like? Imagine a community living along the banks of the Kuwait River 300 generations ago. They are not primitive savages. They live in substantial houses of wood and reed, plastered with mud. They cultivate small gardens of wild grain varieties, supplementing their diet with fish from the river, game from the surrounding grasslands, and gathered fruits and nuts. They have domesticated dogs. They make sophisticated tools of stone, bone, and shell. They create art, carved figurines, decorated pottery, beads, and ornaments. They have language, culture, religion, and social hierarchies. And slowly, across the span of lifetimes, they notice changes. The elders tell stories of when the river mouth was many days' journey to the south, but now it seems closer. Wells that once gave fresh water have turned salty. The fish are different species from the sea mixing with the river fish. Storms bring higher tides, and some of the lowest-lying fields near the river have become marsh, then lagoon, then are simply abandoned to the encroaching waters. At first, it was manageable. The community simply moves its settlement slightly inland, slightly upriver. New fields are cleared, new houses are built. The old village site is left to the water, but the water keeps coming. Generation after generation, the community moves, and each time they move, they encounter other communities, also displaced, also seeking higher ground. Sometimes these encounters are peaceful, marriages and alliances are formed. Sometimes there is conflict over the best land, the best fishing grounds, the sacred sites, and ancestral territories. Over centuries, the whole cultural landscape shifts. The center of population moves northward, following the retreating freshwater zone. Communities that once were peripheral, living in the foothills and highlands, now find themselves absorbing wave after wave of refugees from the drowned valley. These refugees bring new technologies, new crops, new social structures. The fusion of valley and highland cultures creates something unprecedented. Perhaps this is when agriculture truly takes off, not as a single invention in a single place, but as an accelerated development driven by necessity and the mixing of populations. People who had experimented with cultivation in the valley, who knew which plants responded to human tending, who understood the rhythms of planting and harvest, found themselves in new environments where these skills could be refined and expanded. The highland crops merged with valley crops. New hybrid farming systems emerged. Population density increased. Villages became larger, more permanent, more complex. By the time the Gulf had fully flooded, around 6,000 years ago, the populations that had been displaced had fundamentally transformed the societies they joined. The cultural epicenter had shifted to Mesopotamia, to the alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates. But these rivers were not the easy, gentle environments the valley had been. They flooded unpredictably. They required irrigation to be productive. Managing them demanded cooperation on a scale that had never been necessary before. And so, necessity drove innovation. Communities developed irrigation systems, canals and dikes to control the flood and direct water to fields. But irrigation systems require organization, leadership, administration. Disputes over water require adjudication. Record-keeping becomes essential. And from these practical needs, the apparatus of civilization emerges. Temples to coordinate labor and store surplus, priesthoods to administer and record, writing to keep accounts, laws to regulate society, armies to defend the irrigation systems and the surplus they produce. By 5,000 years ago, the first true cities appeared in Mesopotamia, Eridu, Ur, Uruk. Monumental architecture rises from the plain, ziggurats, temples, palaces. Writing develops from simple accounting marks to full linguistic expression. Kings claim divine authority. Empires begin their long, bloody history. And the drowned valley is forgotten, remembered only in myths of a paradise lost, a time before the flood, when life was simpler. But the valley is not gone. It is merely hidden. Every year, sediment from the Tigris, Euphrates and Karun rivers washes into the Persian Gulf, settling onto the ancient landscape, burying it deeper. Yet it remains, preserved beneath the mud and water, a vast archaeological site stretching for hundreds of kilometers, containing potentially thousands of settlement sites, spanning thousands of years of human prehistory. It is arguably the most important unexcavated archaeological region on Earth. Access has always been the primary obstacle. The Persian Gulf is a geopolitically sensitive region, bordered by nations that have often been in conflict. Oil extraction, the primary economic activity in the Gulf, takes precedence over archaeological exploration. Underwater archaeology is expensive and technically challenging even in the best circumstances. In the turbid, polluted waters of the modern Gulf, visibility is often near zero. The sediment is thick, the environment is harsh. Yet technology advances. Side-scan sonar can now map the seafloor in unprecedented detail. Sub-bottom profilers can see through layers of sediment to detect buried structures. Remotely operated underwater vehicles can explore areas too dangerous or difficult for human divers. Computational analysis can process vast datasets to identify anomalies that might indicate human-made structures. As these technologies become more accessible and more powerful, the prospect of systematically surveying the drowned valley becomes realistic.